Imagine discovering that the name you have carried for your entire life is not actually the oldest part of your identity. Imagine learning that while your surname may first appear in surviving records only a few hundred years ago, the family behind it could have witnessed the collapse of Roman Britain, the rise of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Viking settlement, the Norman conquest, plague, civil war, and the birth of modern Britain long before anyone ever wrote that name on a piece of parchment. Most of us believe our surname is where our family story begins. It is the name we inherit, the name we sign, and the name we hope will continue through future generations. Yet history quietly suggests something very different. A surname is not necessarily the beginning of a family. More often, it is simply the moment that family becomes visible in the surviving historical record. Everything before that point is hidden behind centuries of forgotten lives, changing languages, and records that either never existed or failed to survive. The question then is not simply how old your surname is. The real mystery is whether your family story began long before the surname itself. That is the journey we are about to take. By the end of this documentary, you will discover how hereditary surnames really developed across Britain, why many family names appear younger than the families who carry them, how ordinary people survived four of the greatest transformations in British history, and how historians combine genealogy, archaeology, historical linguistics, and modern genetic research to reconstruct stories that written records alone could never reveal. More importantly, you will begin looking at your own surname in an entirely different way. Instead of asking when your family name first appeared in history, you may find yourself asking a much bigger question. Who were the people carrying your family forward before that name ever existed? If you enjoy discovering the hidden history behind British surnames, forgotten ancestors, and family origins, subscribe to UK Bloodlines. Every week, we uncover remarkable stories that may still be hiding inside your own family tree. And before we continue, tell us your surname in the comments and the oldest town, village, county, or region your family comes from. Keep that place in your mind throughout this documentary because, as you will soon discover, the oldest clue to your family's story may not be your surname at all. It may be the place your ancestors never truly left. Today, asking someone for their family name is one of the simplest questions imaginable. Smith, Jones, Taylor, Campbell, Davies, Howard, Brown. These names feel permanent, almost as though they have always existed. But if we begin traveling backwards through history, something remarkable happens. Familiar spellings begin to disappear. Then familiar surnames disappear altogether. Eventually, we reach a time when millions of people living across Britain had no hereditary surname in the modern sense. At first glance, this creates a strange illusion. It almost appears as though thousands of families suddenly emerged during the Middle Ages. Yet families do not begin because someone finally writes their name into a document. They existed long before history happened to notice them. Imagine walking into a small English village around the year 1250. Smoke rises from timber cottages while farmers return from open fields before sunset. Children chase one another between houses. Merchants unload goods from pack horses. And somewhere in the distance, the steady rhythm of a blacksmith's hammer echoes across the village. If you ask one man his name, he introduces himself simply as William, son of Robert. Another is John the Miller, because he operates the village mill. A woman is known as Alice at the Wood, because her family lives beside the woodland. Another household is recognized by the hill on which their home stands. None of these descriptions were originally intended to become permanent family names. They were practical ways of distinguishing one neighbor from another in communities that were becoming larger, busier, and more connected than ever before. No one standing there could have imagined that centuries later, millions of people would inherit these descriptions as surnames. That single observation changes the way we think about family history. If hereditary surnames developed gradually rather than appearing all at once, then every family living in Britain already had a story before those surnames became permanent. Parents still raised children. Grandparents still passed down memories. Families still inherited land, occupations, skills, and traditions. Identity existed without a hereditary surname because identity was rooted in relationships rather than paperwork. People knew who your parents were, where your family lived, whose fields you worked, and which neighbors your grandparents had known. Memory performed the role that official records would later assume. In many communities, a family's history was preserved not by clerks writing on parchment, but by generations who simply remembered. As Britain changed, however, memory alone was no longer enough. Trade expanded beyond local markets. Small settlements developed into thriving towns. Land ownership became increasingly valuable. and governments required more accurate ways of identifying individuals for taxation, legal disputes, inheritance, and military obligations. Churches gradually kept more consistent records of baptisms, marriages, and burials. Local officials needed to distinguish between several men who might all be called William or John. Practical descriptions that once belonged only to individuals slowly became attached to entire families. William the baker had children who became known by the same description. A family living beside the hill remained associated with that landscape for generations. A son identified by his father's name eventually passed that identity to his own children. The transformation happened so gradually that almost nobody living through it would have recognized they were creating one of the defining features of modern identity. Even then, Britain did not adopt hereditary surnames in a single uniform way. England generally established fixed surnames earlier than many parts of Wales, where patronymic traditions remained common for much longer. Across much of the Scottish Highlands, clan identity often carried greater significance than a fixed hereditary surname. Ireland preserved rich Gaelic naming traditions that developed alongside later English influences. Britain was never one story told in one language or shaped by one culture. It was a collection of different peoples adapting to changing circumstances over many centuries, and their naming traditions evolved just as differently. That is one reason surname research is rarely straightforward. Two people with identical surnames may have entirely separate origins, while two families with different modern surnames may once have belonged to the same medieval community before language and spelling gradually carried them in different directions. Now consider your own surname again. Perhaps you have traced it back 300 years, perhaps 600. Perhaps you have found its earliest appearance in a parish register, a tax record, or an old legal document, and assumed that was where your family's story began. But what if that document represents only the earliest evidence that survived? What about the generations whose names were never recorded, whose documents were destroyed, or who lived in communities where history was preserved by memory instead of ink? The absence of a surviving record has never been proof that a family did not exist. It simply reminds us how much of the past has been lost. And that leads us to the question that changes everything. If families existed long before hereditary surnames became common, what happened to those families as Britain itself was transformed? They lived through the arrival of Roman armies, the emergence of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the settlement of Vikings, and the Norman conquest. Some adapted to new languages, others adopted new customs. Many saw the names by which they were known gradually change over generations. But did the families themselves disappear? Or did they simply continue under different names? To answer that question, we must travel back to a Britain before surnames, before medieval records, and even before England itself, because the oldest chapter of your family's story may have begun in a world where the name you know today had not yet been imagined. Long before hereditary surnames became part of everyday life, Britain was already home to countless families whose histories stretched back through generations that no written record would ever preserve. They did not think of themselves as founders of family lines or ancestors waiting to be discovered centuries later. They were farmers, craftsmen, herders, traders, and fishermen, concerned with surviving another winter, raising children, and protecting the land that sustained them. Their identities were rooted not in permanent surnames, but in kinship, reputation, and place. Everyone knew whose son you were, whose daughter you had married, which household you belonged to, and where your family had lived for as long as anyone could remember. In communities where nearly everyone knew one another, that was more than enough. The story of a family was carried in memory instead of documents, spoken aloud around fires rather than written onto parchment, and passed from one generation to the next with remarkable consistency. Yet those unwritten family histories were about to be tested by some of the greatest changes Britain had ever experienced. The first of those transformations arrived in AD 43, when Roman legions crossed the English Channel and began the conquest of much of Britain. To later generations, Roman Britain often appears as the beginning of recorded British history, but it is important to remember that the Romans entered a land that was already inhabited by thriving communities. Celtic-speaking peoples had cultivated fields, built hill forts, traded across the sea, and established complex tribal societies long before the first Roman standard appeared on the horizon. The Romans did not create Britain's population, they became part of its story. They introduced roads, towns, stone buildings, new systems of government, and a vast trading network that connected Britain to an empire stretching from North Africa to the Middle East. Soldiers, merchants, craftsmen, and administrators arrived from many different parts of the Roman world, bringing with them new languages, customs, and ideas. Some local families embraced these changes, while others continued living much as they always had. Archaeology suggests that in many rural areas, life evolved gradually, rather than changing overnight. Roman influence was significant, but it rarely erased the communities that already existed. Imagine standing beside a newly built Roman road stretching across the countryside. Soldiers march in disciplined formation, while traders follow with wagons carrying pottery, wine, olive oil, and goods from distant provinces. Nearby, local farmers pause to watch, before returning to fields that may have belonged to their families for generations. Their children might grow up speaking a little Latin alongside their native language. They may trade in Roman towns or adopt new fashions, but when evening comes, they still return to the same families, the same farms, and the same landscapes their ancestors had known. Governments changed, daily life adapted, families continued. This pattern would repeat itself again and again throughout British history. By the early 5th century, Roman authority began to collapse. Imperial troops were gradually withdrawn, towns declined, and the political structures that had governed Britain for centuries weakened. To those living through it, the disappearance of Roman rule must have felt like the end of an age. Yet history often focuses on the fall of empires, while overlooking the lives of ordinary people. Most families still had fields to harvest, animals to feed, homes to repair, and children to raise. They did not simply disappear because one government came to an end. Many communities remained where they had always been, adapting to a changing world much as earlier generations had done before them. Once again, rulers changed faster than families. Then came another turning point. Across the North Sea, groups from regions that now form parts of northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands gradually settled in Britain. Today we know them collectively as the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. Their arrival reshaped much of southern and eastern Britain over several centuries, giving rise to new kingdoms and laying the foundations of what would become England. For many years, historians described this period as though one population had simply replaced another. Modern archaeological discoveries and advances in ancient DNA research have revealed a much more complex picture. Different regions experienced these migrations in different ways. Some areas saw substantial settlement from continental Europe, while others show stronger evidence of continuity with communities already living there. Rather than one simple story of replacement, Britain experienced centuries of migration, coexistence, intermarriage, and cultural exchange. Picture a settlement where children grow up hearing different languages spoken around neighboring homes. One household preserves traditions inherited from earlier British communities, while another speaks a Germanic dialect brought across the sea. Markets bring people together. Marriages unite families from different backgrounds. Children inherit customs from both parents without ever considering that future generations will debate where one people ended and another began. Over time, languages change, identities evolve, and communities become something entirely new. History rarely moves in clean lines. More often, it blends gradually, almost unnoticed by the people living through it. One of the clearest reminders of this continuity survives in Britain's landscape itself. Many rivers still bear names that predate the Anglo-Saxons. Ancient place names preserve words from languages spoken long before England existed. Hills, valleys, and forests often remember the past more faithfully than written documents do. Every time we look at a map, we are seeing layers of history resting upon one another. New names appeared, older names survived, and families continued living among them. The landscape became a living archive, quietly preserving memories that no medieval scribe ever intended to record. But this raises another question. If new kingdoms emerged and new languages spread across Britain, what happened to the families who were already there? The simplest answer is that many adapted. Some adopted the language of those who held political power. Others preserved older traditions for generations. Communities merged, new identities formed. A family's language could change within a few generations, while its ancestry stretched much further into the past. That is why historians are careful not to assume that a change in language automatically means a complete change in population. People are capable of adopting new customs without abandoning their family history. Just as these new kingdoms became firmly established, another wave of change approached Britain's shores. Towards the end of the 8th century, Scandinavian raiders began attacking monasteries and coastal settlements. Their swift longships and sudden assaults left such an impression that the period has become synonymous with Viking raids. Yet the Viking Age was never simply a story of violence. Many Scandinavians eventually settled permanently, establishing farms, trading centers, and communities across large parts of northern and eastern England, the Scottish Islands, and parts of Ireland. Over time, They became neighbors rather than invaders, contributing to local economies, marrying into existing communities, and influencing the language people spoke every day. Imagine walking through the busy streets of York during the Viking Age. Merchants negotiate in several languages. Blacksmiths forge tools for local farmers and travelers arriving from distant lands. Silver coins pass from hand to hand. Children play in streets where some families have Scandinavian roots, others trace their ancestry to earlier English communities, and many already share both. The world around them is changing, but not through the sudden disappearance of one people and the arrival of another. It is changing because ordinary families are living alongside one another, building new communities from older ones. The influence of this period remains visible today. Hundreds of place names ending in by Thorpe and Thwaite reflect Scandinavian settlement, while everyday English words such as sky, window, knife, egg, and husband entered the language through Old Norse. Yet it is important not to jump to easy conclusions. Living in a village with a Norse place name does not automatically mean a family descends directly from Viking settlers. Equally, a family with deep Scandinavian ancestry may eventually carry a surname that appears entirely English. History rarely leaves such simple clues. The movement of people, languages, and identities is almost always more complicated than it first appears. Which brings us once again to the same question that has followed us from the beginning of this investigation. What happened to the families already living there? They witnessed Roman rule, adapted to new kingdoms, encountered new languages, welcomed or resisted newcomers, survived periods of conflict, and continued raising the next generation. Their identities evolved because history itself evolved around them. They did not necessarily remain unchanged, but neither did they simply vanish. That understanding becomes even more important when we arrive at the event that transformed England's written history more dramatically than almost any other, the Norman conquest of 1066. Many people assume this was the moment their family's story truly began because this is where written records become richer and more detailed. Yet the next stage of our journey reveals why the appearance of a surname in medieval documents often tells us much more about the growth of record keeping than it does about the true age of the family behind it. The year 1066 stands as one of the most famous dates in British history. Children learn about it in school, historians return to it repeatedly, and for many people, researching their ancestry, it feels like the point where the past suddenly becomes clearer. William, Duke of Normandy, crossed the English Channel, defeated King Harold II at the Battle of Hastings, and claimed the English throne. Within a generation, castles rose across the landscape. Norman French became the language of the royal court and much of the aristocracy, and England's political system was transformed. It is tempting to imagine that the Norman conquest created an entirely new country, sweeping away everything that came before. Yet if you had stood in an ordinary farming village only a few years after the conquest, the view might have surprised you. The same rivers still flowed through the valleys. The same fields were plowed. The same families rose before sunrise to tend livestock and harvest crops. Their rulers had changed, but their daily lives continued. This distinction is one of the most important keys to understanding the true history of British surnames. Imagine a village in the years following the conquest. A Norman lord now occupies a newly built castle overlooking land that had belonged to an English noble before 1066. Officials speak Norman French in the manor court while legal documents are written in Latin. Yet outside those halls, farmers still speak English. Children still play in the lanes between timber houses, and neighbors continue recognizing one another through family, reputation, and place. History often remembers kings and conquerors because they left written records behind, but ordinary families rarely vanish simply because political power changes hands. More often, they adapt. Their language gradually evolves, their customs slowly absorb new influences, and over time, even the way their names are written begins to change. One of the greatest legacies of the Norman period was not simply new rulers, but a dramatic expansion in written administration. Kings wanted to know who owned land, what resources existed, and who owed taxes or military service. Churches increasingly recorded baptisms, marriages, and burials. Manor courts documented disputes over property and inheritance. Royal officials kept financial accounts with growing precision. Britain was becoming a society where written records mattered more than ever before. For historians and genealogists, this was an extraordinary development because families who had existed for generations were beginning to appear more regularly in surviving documents. Yet that creates an illusion that still misleads people today. When a surname first appears in one of these records, it is easy to assume that the family itself also began at that moment. In reality, the record often marks only the first surviving written evidence of people who had already been living there for centuries. Perhaps no document illustrates this better than the Domesday Book, completed in 1086. Commissioned by William the Conqueror, it was designed to record landholdings and resources across much of England so that the crown could understand the wealth of the kingdom. It remains one of the most remarkable administrative surveys ever produced in medieval Europe. Yet, despite its importance, the Domesday Book is frequently misunderstood. Many people expect it to contain familiar hereditary surnames, but that was not its purpose. Most individuals appear with personal names, occupations, places of origin, or descriptive phrases, rather than fixed family surnames. The document captures England during a period of transition, when hereditary surnames were still developing rather than fully established. Instead of showing finished family names, it preserves the foundations from which many later surnames would emerge. Imagine a man recorded simply as Edwin, son of Wulfstan. His son later moves to another village and becomes known as Richard of Ashford. Richard's children remain there for generations, and eventually, Ashford is no longer merely a description of where they live. It becomes the family's hereditary surname. Hundreds of years later, someone researching the Ashford family might discover the earliest surviving reference to that surname and conclude that this is where the family began. Yet the family itself had existed long before the surname became permanent. Only the label had changed. The same process occurred in countless different ways across Britain. Occupational descriptions gradually became inherited surnames. A blacksmith's descendants became Smith, even when later generations no longer worked with iron. Families living beside hills became Hill. Those living near woodland became Atwood or Wood. A man recognized as John Carpenter might pass that description to children and grandchildren who never built a single cart or roof. Patronymics followed a similar path. A son, once identified simply as the child of Richard or John, eventually belonged to a family that permanently carried Richardson or Johnson. Place names became surnames when families left one settlement for another and were identified by where they had come from. None of these changes created new families. They simply gave existing families new ways of being recognized. Complicating matters even further was the absence of standard spelling. Medieval clerks wrote names according to local pronunciation, personal preference, or the language in which they were recording the document. A single individual might appear under several different spellings during his lifetime, and different branches of the same family could gradually develop different versions of what had once been the same name. Smith might appear as Smith or Smythe. Clark could become Clark. Green might also be written Green. Even more dramatic variations occurred as Old English names passed through Norman French and Latin before eventually settling into modern English forms. To modern eyes, these differences can appear to represent entirely separate families, but often they simply reflect the evolution of language rather than the creation of new lineages. This is why historians rarely rely on spelling alone when tracing surname history. They look for patterns across multiple generations, places, and documents. They study the evolution of language, local geography, family relationships, and historical context. A surname is far more than a word. It is the result of centuries of linguistic change, social development, and human adaptation. In some cases, two families sharing the same modern surname have no recent common ancestor because identical occupational or locational names arose independently in different regions. In other cases, two families with completely different modern surnames may descend from ancestors whose names diverged centuries ago as spelling, pronunciation, or place of residence changed. The history of surnames is therefore not a straight line, but a branching river, constantly dividing and rejoining as generations pass. As written records became more frequent, other sources gradually joined the growing archive of Britain's family history. Manor court rolls preserved disputes over land and inheritance. Royal tax records listed thousands of ordinary people who might otherwise have disappeared from history. Charters documented gifts of land and agreements between families. Later, parish registers began recording baptisms, marriages, and burials with increasing consistency, allowing genealogists to trace many family lines further than ever before. Each surviving document added another piece to the puzzle, helping historians reconstruct lives that would otherwise have been forgotten. Yet even with this expanding body of evidence, every family tree eventually reaches a point where surviving records become scarce. Beyond that boundary, certainty gives way to careful interpretation. So consider your own surname once more. Have you ever noticed different spellings in old certificates, census records, or family documents? Has an older relative ever pronounced it differently from the way it is spoken today? Does your family still live close to the place where your earliest known ancestors were recorded? Questions like these may seem small, yet they often reveal something much larger. A surname is not frozen in time, It is a living record of changing languages, changing societies, and changing ways of identifying the same people. The name may have evolved repeatedly, but the family behind it often continued through every transformation. By now, one truth should be becoming increasingly clear. The first written appearance of a surname is rarely the first chapter of a family's story. More often, it is simply the point where surviving records become detailed enough for us to recognize that family by the name we know today. The deeper history almost always lies beyond the parchment itself. If we truly want to understand how old a family may be, we must look beyond surnames alone and begin asking a different question. What happens when archaeology, genealogy, and modern genetic research are examined together? Can science help us see beyond the limits of written history without claiming more certainty than the evidence allows? The answer is more remarkable and more carefully balanced than many people expect, because the oldest part of your family history may never have been your surname at all. Until now, every clue has pointed us towards the same possibility. Written records can tell us when a surname appears. Historical linguistics can help explain where that surname came from and how its spelling or pronunciation may have changed. Genealogy can sometimes connect one documented generation to another. Archaeology can reveal the communities and landscapes in which earlier generations lived. But none of these, on their own, can completely answer the question that has followed us from the beginning of this journey. If your surname is younger than your family, how can we investigate what happened before the written record falls silent? For centuries, that silence marked the boundary of family history. A parish register ended. A manor court roll went no further. A medieval charter mentioned one individual, but revealed nothing about the generations before him. Beyond that point lay uncertainty. Today, however, historians can bring different kinds of evidence together. Archaeology, historical linguistics, documentary genealogy, surname studies, and population genetics can each reveal a different part of Britain's past. None can magically reconstruct a thousand-year family tree, and none can prove that an ordinary modern family has remained in one place continuously for a millennium without supporting evidence. But together, they reveal something far more interesting. Surnames are only one layer of a much deeper human story. Imagine standing in a quiet British village today. The cottages may be built from brick or stone instead of timber, the roads paved rather than muddy, and machines now work fields once cultivated by hand. Yet beneath that modern landscape may lie traces of completely different worlds. Archaeologists uncover medieval settlements near earlier Roman sites, ancient field systems beneath later boundaries, and evidence that some landscapes were repeatedly inhabited across very long periods. This does not prove that one particular modern family occupied the same village throughout all those centuries, but it demonstrates something essential to our investigation. Places can preserve continuity even when written records cannot. A road may follow an ancient route. A parish boundary may preserve an older division of land. A river may carry a name inherited from a language spoken before English existed. Sometimes the landscape remembers what documents have forgotten. Names can preserve similar clues, although interpreting them requires care. Consider a surname derived from an occupation such as smith. It may sound extraordinarily ancient because smithing itself stretches deep into Britain's past, but that does not mean every person called Smith descends from one original medieval Smith family. The surname could arise independently wherever a man was identified by that occupation. Now compare that with a rarer surname derived from a particular settlement. If generations bearing variations of that name repeatedly appear around the same locality, researchers may have a much narrower trail to investigate. Even then, the earliest surviving spelling is evidence of the name at that date, not proof that the family began there. This is precisely why surname research becomes so fascinating. Identical surnames can conceal unrelated origins, while surnames that look different today may sometimes descend from related earlier forms. Spelling makes the mystery even more complicated. Medieval and early modern names were not fixed in the way we expect today. Clerks wrote what they heard, and pronunciation varied dramatically from one region to another. A surname could be recorded differently in Latin, French, or English contexts, while literacy and local dialect influenced how later generations understood it. Smith, and Smythe can reflect variations of the same occupational surname, while Clark and Clark show how relatively small spelling differences could become permanent. More substantial changes were also possible. Families moved, pronunciations shifted, names were shortened, and some identities were replaced altogether. This means that searching only for the modern spelling of your surname can sometimes lead you towards a false beginning. The oldest clue may be hiding behind a version of the name that you would barely recognize today. Modern genetics has added another remarkable tool. But this is also where family history claims can become misleading if we are not careful. DNA cannot tell you that your surname is 1,000 years old, nor can an ordinary consumer DNA result simply identify one ancestor as Roman, another as Anglo-Saxon, and another as Viking, with the certainty those labels sometimes imply. Genetics is far more powerful when used to examine relationships and broader patterns of population history. Ancient DNA recovered from archaeological remains has transformed our understanding of migrations into Britain, while modern genetic studies can reveal patterns of shared ancestry and regional population structure. Y DNA can be particularly useful in some surname studies because the Y chromosome passes along the direct paternal line, historically resembling the way many British surnames were transmitted from father to son. If several men carrying the same unusual surname also share closely related Y DNA, that may support the possibility of a shared paternal ancestor. But even then, DNA does not tell us what that ancestor called himself. Biology can extend beyond the surname without revealing the name itself. That distinction may be the most important discovery in this entire investigation. A surname belongs to cultural and documentary history. DNA belongs to biological inheritance. Archaeology belongs to material evidence. Linguistics reveals how words and names evolved. Genealogy attempts to connect identifiable people through surviving records. When these different forms of evidence point in the same direction, the picture becomes stronger. But responsible family history never pretends that one kind of evidence can answer every question. Sometimes the most accurate conclusion is simply that a family line may extend much further into the past than surviving documents allow us to demonstrate. So return once more to the place you mentioned at the beginning of this documentary. Perhaps your oldest known family connection is to Yorkshire, Cornwall, Wales, the Scottish borders, the Highlands, East Anglia, or an Irish parish. Perhaps your documentary trail reaches the 18th century and stops. Perhaps you have been fortunate enough to reach the 16th century or beyond. Now look beyond the surname itself. Does the family repeatedly appear in neighboring parishes? Are older spelling variations clustered in the same area? Is the surname derived from a local place, landscape feature, occupation, or personal name? Does the village itself have a history stretching far beyond your earliest known ancestor? None of these clues alone proves that your family has lived there for 1,000 years. But together they can tell you where the next investigation should begin. And suddenly the question is no longer simply, when did my surname begin? It becomes, what existed before it? Perhaps that is the real discovery hidden inside Britain's family names. We often search for the earliest surviving spelling as though finding it will reveal the moment our family entered history. But a medieval document does not create the person whose name appears upon it. It merely allows us to see them. Behind that individual stood parents, grandparents, and generations whose names may never survive. Some moved across Britain. Some arrived from elsewhere. Some remained close to the landscapes where their descendants would later appear in written records. Their identities changed as languages, governments, religions, occupations, and communities changed around them. What eventually became a hereditary surname was only one stage in that much longer journey. Before we finish, tell us your surname in the comments, along with the oldest place you have traced your family to. Have you discovered an earlier spelling of your name? Does one village or county appear repeatedly in your family tree? And how far back have you managed to follow the documentary trail? Sometimes the smallest clue, a forgotten spelling, a neighboring parish, an unusual place name, can completely change where the search leads next. And if this journey has made you question what your surname really represents, subscribe to UK Bloodlines and tell us which surname mystery you think we should investigate next. Because perhaps your surname is not the oldest part of your identity. Perhaps it never was. Perhaps it is simply the newest surviving name attached to a story that had already been unfolding for generations before anyone thought to write it down. Kingdoms rose and disappeared. Languages changed. Borders moved. Villages grew, vanished, and sometimes returned beneath modern towns. Names were translated, shortened, respelled, inherited, and occasionally forgotten altogether. Yet generation after generation continued. Somewhere beyond the final parish register, beyond the oldest tax roll, beyond the faded charter where your surname seems to appear for the first time, there were people whose names you may never know, but whose lives made yours possible. Your surname can tell you where one part of the trail becomes visible. It can preserve a place, an occupation, a father, a landscape, or a fragment of a language spoken centuries ago. But it cannot contain the whole story. The oldest part of your family history may lie beyond the name itself, among generations that survived without leaving you a signature. And somewhere in that extraordinary chain of forgotten lives, stretching backwards through the changing history of Britain, is you.